So welcome to the Diligent webinar on how to conduct better board evaluations. My name's Joanne McMaster. I'm a sales director with Diligent, and shortly I'll introduce you to our speakers. For those of you who don't know who Diligent are, Diligent Boards is the world's leader in board collaboration software, designed for directors to be able to access their board papers from anywhere in the world at any time on any device of their choice. Diligent also has an evaluations model, and the model is designed to create or allow you to conduct customised evaluations with a familiar interface in a very secure environment. A couple of housekeeping notes before we move on and get started. So you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so if you'd like to submit your questions via the chat panel, we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. Some of the topics we're going to cover, I will just jump through. Actually, first I'll introduce our guest speakers, Andrew Horn. So Andrew is President of the GIA, ICSA Australia Division and Specialist Corporate Governance Advisor at Effective Governance. Andrew brings with him a wealth of experience. We're really pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Joanne. Good morning, Marie. Good morning, everybody.
So Dr. Anne-Marie Moody is a corporate governance professional and qualified company secretary with 15 years experience advising boards, CEOs and senior executive teams. So nice to have you here too. Thanks, Anne-Marie. So some of the topics we're going to cover today, we'll just touch on these, are firstly we're going to have a look at why companies are doing evaluations. We'll then jump in and look at some of the challenges that organisations face in terms of evaluations. We'll delve into what the benefits evaluations provide are, and then we're going to investigate some of the delivery mechanisms. And as I said, then we'll get to some question and answers at the end of this. But we're going to start by taking a poll. So you should be able to see on your screen, we're just trying to gauge how many people are currently using evaluations. So if you can just click yes or no, and we'll see those results shortly. So Andrew, just over to you. I think, starting on the first topic of conversation, in your thoughts, can you give us some insight into why companies do evaluations?
Thanks, Joanne. An effective board evaluation is really core to the governance framework of all organisations. The corporate governance guidelines and recommendations now have recommended a board evaluation at least annually on an informal or formal basis, and the outcomes of those now have been widely accepted through the industry as being a framework for continuous improvement for boards. And the continuous improvement is a number of levels. It's board dynamics, the process of the boards, the information flow between the board directors and the management team, and also the performance of the organisation. So there's empirical data which suggests that good governance, which includes an effective evaluation process, does lead to improved organisational performance.
Yep. Anne-Marie, would you like to add to?
Look, certainly, and I think to add to what Andrew's saying, obviously a board evaluation will differ between the different sectors out there. Listed companies must do a board performance review every year under the ASX principles. But the really good thing is that the ASX principles, while they've been around for a long time, have now been adapted and adopted by many other sectors. So while the not-for-profit sector obviously has got nothing to do with the listed sector, not-for-profit clients will use the ASX guidelines as a template or as a framework for an example of good governance to do their board evaluations against. And I think the good thing about the ASX principles is that they're not so specific that they tie in a client to how they do a board evaluation, what sort of questions they ask, what sort of outcomes they want. And that can be both a challenge and a benefit to clients.
Sure. So, you were saying that the non-profits use the ASX guidelines. In your experience, is that fairly common to most organisations, or is it specific to the non-profit sector that follow those guidelines and the ASX guidelines? Or
well, look, the good thing about the ASX guidelines is that they have constantly evolved and changed and been reviewed over the past 15 years. So therefore, they are seen as very, very much a good example of a template against which to do an evaluation. But in the time that I've been doing board evaluations, a lot has changed, and I think generally most boards will do a board evaluation regardless of what sector they're in. They will do it regularly, whether it's every year, every second year or every third year, depending on
And what
their sources.
dictates that, how the frequency? Is that driven by change in the organisation? Is it driven by, what dictates that?
Well, look, the appetite for a board review can differ from board to board as much as from sector to sector.
Yeah.
One of the things that might mean that a not-for-profit will only do a board review every second year will be resources, time, and that includes the ability to pay for an external review if that's what they want. In the listed sector, they will do it every year, but generally we'll have an external person such as myself come in every second year and do an internal review in the interim.
Right.
And that also gives them an opportunity to implement the recommendations that have been made in an external review.
Sure, and I guess that's one of the questions that came up for me, as a novice in this process is, how do you take the results and how do you ensure improvement based on, it's one thing to conduct an evaluation, but then how do you measure that improvement and what happens following the evaluation process?
Yeah, thank you. I think the evaluation process leads to a number of observations which the consultant or the software produce, which are picked up by the chair and the individual directors. And there's an ongoing process of continuous improvement where, particularly after each board meeting, generally there's a discussion about performance, and the information is collated so that at the end of each year, when you do your informal or formal review, it provides a larger framework for performance instead of a snapshot based on a deep dive questionnaire basis. So basically it's a continuous improvement, and it just sets the scene, which is reviewed periodically, but generally it's a continuous improvement process, not just once a year or once every 2 years.
So you're doing regular check-ins to see how you're progressing
yes.
and what's improved. Yep. Got it. Okay, so look, I guess, let's have a look at the results and see what we've got in the way of who's actually conducting evaluations at the moment. And I can see that there's roughly 41% of people who have answered the poll are conducting evaluations. So one of the things that I come across fairly regularly when I'm out there speaking to boards or organisations is I'll ask the question, are you currently doing evaluations and how frequently? Oftentimes people will say, no, we're not. And when I ask why, where the gap is, I think that people are sometimes unsure of where to commence that process or how to begin. So what are some of the challenges? I mean, let's look at some of the challenges that we see organised facing at the moment and where to start. So, Anne-Marie, one of the key challenges as you see it is size and maturity of the organisation. Can you talk us through that a little?
Certainly. Look, if you've got a very small organisation, no matter what sector it's in, then doing a regular board performance review may be a lot to ask for them to do that. And there are options to perhaps do something more light touch as opposed to a more extensive board review for that. But all the way up to a mature organisation, such as an ASX 100 company, for example, while they will do a board review every year, they don't necessarily do it at the same time of the year.
Right.
And a range of factors can play into that. They might have every intention in the board calendar that they're going to do their board review in April, but there might be something happen such as, the CEO resigns unexpectedly or the chairman changes unexpectedly, and therefore those events supersede or take over.
It gets put by the way by and then move on with other things.
And you'll need to move on and perhaps do the review later on. So that will change all the time. But I think the most important thing is to have that intent that you're going to do a board review, that you understand the purpose of it, what you expect the objectives to be, and once you have the recommendations from the review, that as a board you understand that you need to debate whether or not you take on those recommendations. Once you do, that you actually do implement them.
Sure.
And this is where the chairman plays a very important role. The chairman is often also the chairman of the nominations committee, so the recommendations from the review then become part of the nominations committee's remit for the next year. So a number of factors can come into play, but as long as I think you have the intent and you do follow through with that, then you'll have a regular a board evaluation process going on throughout the years.
Sure. Okay. In terms of other challenges, we discussed that there's, sometimes it's about having board buy-in, right? So, and educating boards about the the importance or, what it will do for the organisation. So can you talk us through how that process works?
Yeah, certainly. In terms of the board, a board role is very challenging because all directors by law are required to come with independent judgment. But they bring obviously a variety of skills, experience, biases and backgrounds to the table. So to suspend those conflicts potentially and to focus on what's in the best interest of the organisation is a big challenge. And so therefore the process has to be structured around bringing people to the mindset that looking at continuous improvement in their own performance and often the challenge of a collaboration, a dynamic board, a board that encourages a cohesive discussion, but also encourages people to speak candidly about their concerns, and for the chair to manage the process so that they achieve outcomes is a skill that is highly developed amongst most directors, and most directors are on a continuous journey of improvement in order to fit within their organisation but improve their performance around the table to get the best outcome for themselves and the organisation.
I think a follow-up point to that is, back in 2001 I wrote a book about board performance.
Right.
And at the time I interviewed about 40 prominent directors and chairmen, and this was when board performance reviews were very new. And one of the things I was told was that these directors hadn't been through a process of evaluation before, even as executives.
Right.
This was sort of the change coming in.
So it was brand new.
It was brand new, and
Yeah.
there was a lot of sensitivity around being reviewed.
Sure. But it was viewed as a negative thing, and what are they going to find out about us? That kind of stigma?
Partly negative, partly apprehensive,
Yep.
partly nervous, all of those things. And of course, everything's changed since then, and a board evaluation is just part of what a board does.
Sure.
And the other good thing is that as directors have, as a profession, have developed, often directors who are on boards where board reviews are done regularly also become directors on boards in other sort of sectors, not-for-profits and so on. So you will see senior executives on boards of not-for-profit organisations, and they bring that experience of doing board performance evaluations from their other boards, and it sort of all spreads out almost by osmosis.
So it's almost the culture of the organisation shifts based on who's driving that process.
That's
There is a confidence factor, as you've alluded to, Anne-Marie, in that sense. A lot of directors are reticent to be open and potentially critical of other directors or the processes. So in order to get the environment conducive for those open, candid discussions, it's a carefully managed process, and that process obviously produces the best outcomes where directors feel confident. And there has been a view expressed generally that the confidentiality of their one-on-one interviews is of concern to them, and sometimes a process has to be adopted where there's an assurance that the outcomes will be destroyed or kept confidential to either themselves, other directors, or outside the organisation. So that's a very important discussion to have with the chair and the directors at the outset to set the framework.
And in your experience, do people then, when they are assured of confidentiality, are people fairly candid in these scenarios?
But yes, and I think the engagement process with the consultant and the one-on-one engagement with the chair, scoping the review, talking to individual directors, preparing the questionnaire so that it's targeted, relevant and appropriate to their circumstances. Clearly an ASX 100 or 10 company would have a different profile and concerns to a newly listed or a company or a family company that's looking to list and seek capital or broader community support. So, and it may be other triggers. We talked earlier about what are the triggers. It may be a trigger such as a shock, a compliance shock.
Sure.
We've had some compliance shocks recently where it's perceived there is some systematic breaches in the compliance framework, which raises questions about board awareness and reporting framework. So that might trigger a board review in terms of, do we have the right people on the board who are skilled at these types of these industry expectations. So there's confidentiality, the scoping and the trust is very important in starting the process.
See, and that, you did bring me back to something I was just thinking of earlier, which means, when you're saying that process of assuring people that it's all confidential and setting the scene, etc., clearly there are various types of reviews and evaluations that are conducted. And one of the challenges that often I suspect people would come up against is how do we start and what type of evaluation do we do? You know, do we do a quick tick of the box and get it done, or do we go in depth and invest, you know, significant amounts of money? You know, how do we gauge that?
Yeah.
What's a good starting point?
Well, Anne-Marie, I mean, my observation is that it's like when we're sick. We could do a Google doctor that would give us a framework that there might be a problem, but ultimately it requires a one-on-one conversation with an expert with a targeted set of diagnostics to actually get to the bottom of what it is that suits each organisation in its own special circumstances and the group of people that work together in their situation. So, Anne-Marie, what do you think?
I think that a board performance review can be asked for in a number of different ways. You might have a client who says, look, we've had a discussion as a board, we think we're doing pretty well, but we want your expertise and your knowledge to give us some kind of mirror or reflection on how we think we're going, and if there's anything there that you think we need to address or redress, please let us know. Right through to assignments I've had where I've been asked to see if there's an internal candidate for the chairman's role if the chairman was stepping down.
Right.
Other composition issues and leadership issues, such as whether a board needs to be shrunk and therefore which directors don't fit the skills matrix for the board going forward. So a lot of sensitive things can be,
sure.
and that requires a particular skill to not only be able to receive the information from directors through the interview process, but then be able to present that information as a collective view, maintain the confidentiality of each individual director and what they've said, but present that material back in a way that the board will have an appetite to be able to work with it, rather than be, apprehensive or concerned about working on the recommendations. I think recommendations need to be sustainable and they need to be pragmatic, as well as useful to improve the decision-making capability of the board.
Sure. And as you mentioned earlier, I think, there are various types of organisation, not one size fits all. So it's dependent on the size and the nature of the organisation and the issues they're addressing at the time.
But you mentioned before sort of a tick-the-box approach. I think that's really at one end of the spectrum, and I rarely see boards do that anymore. There used to be myth or truth that the chairman would have a piece of paper with 5 questions, and the first one would be, is the chairman doing a good job? 1, no, right through to 5, yes, and of course everyone would tick 5, and then you'd move on to the next question.
And that'd be visible to the chairman?
And that would be it. Okay. As I say, myth or truth.
Yeah.
Of course that doesn't happen at all anymore, because directors and boards as a whole understand that evaluations do provide enormous value to the board, and if they're going to do it, they're going to do it properly and engage fully in the process.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I think the element of transparency is now more prominent. As you say, the myth of the fireside chat after board meetings has matured now, and the accountability to investors as shareholders, the annual report disclosures to compliance regulators in terms of skills is front of mind now. So I think, and also directors, it is a confronting process to be assessed. No one likes to be assessed, and it's perceived now as being a tool. And people take criticisms or guidance in terms of their ongoing personal development, and particularly as a collection or a group, it's like a sporting team. There's not much point of having a whole lot of individuals who are highly skilled. They've got to collaborate and become a cohesive group that actually achieve the outcomes that are set by the board in terms of their overall strategy, organisational objectives, industry expectations, the community licence to operate. If you're in health or banking or some other industry that is under high-profile scrutiny. So it's a broader process in order of engaging in awareness and development.
Yes.
So in terms of the challenges, I guess, one of the other things is the market environment. So how does that affect the whole process, and how do people kind of deal with the market environment in taking them into evaluations?
The market in terms of the investor market?
Or changing circumstances. So, as you said, let's say the CEO is older, changed, or, some of the chair steps down, whatever that is. Like, does that...
Well, I mean, there's been recent cases in the last few years of major organisations that have taken a strategic investment in a business which has been a failure, which has thrown the spotlight back on the board, the CEO, the chair, and the process that led to that decision. And so investors, once obviously the poor performance comes through in the results, or the business poor performance, then it triggers an internal review, and that obviously creates impetus for board reviews and succession planning and rolling in and out of people who are perceived not to be performing or meeting the objectives of the organisation. We've often seen CEOs leaving at short notice, chairs changing quickly in terms of the stewardship and the responsibility as a leader for the organisation. The chair takes the responsibility of bringing the board forward as a collective and managing the process between the board and the CEO, so there's a good flow of information, accurate information, timely decision making, and keeping on target. So a lot of it is it percolates through to a sudden shock could create a complete change of the lineup in certain situations, or alternatively it may just be a natural progression towards an event such as a listing, or as Anne-Marie said, a joint venture merger where the board is downsized, where there has to be a selection process as to which of the board is going forward, or even a takeover situation where even a new board is created to take the new organisation forward into the next environment. So there could be a number of dynamics happening there which create the process and the dynamics for an evaluation as to what the best board is currently and what the board might look like in the future.
Sure.
And there are two things I think that help drive that. One is the requirement to publish in the corporate governance statement that you've done a board review. And some companies will actually go ahead and say, we've done a board review, say whether it's internal or external. And if it's external, we'll say that the board review found that we need to address, for argument's sake, succession planning and committee structure. And that's what we're going ahead to do. It won't give you any more details, but we'll give you a general sort of broad brush perspective. The other thing that I think that's driven this is the requirement for a skills matrix amongst the board, and that can trigger a board review in and of itself. And we read a lot about the digitisation of business and the requirements for directors to, just as much as they should be able to read a financial statement, they should understand about the digital environment too. But you also need an expert, I think, for some organisations.
To sit on the board? To
sit on the board.
And is that fairly common?
It depends on the organisation, and again depends on the board's appetite. But those specific skills, some of those new skills, can also drive the reason for a board performance review.
So the composition of the board, and you're saying we're lacking in particular skill gaps.
Please look at the skills matrix. This is our strategy. Where do we match up and where don't we? And what's your advice on how we can fill those gaps, whether it be training for existing directors or actually going out and seeking a director with those specific skills. So I think for some organisations with board evaluations that I'm engaged for, they want to do the annual board evaluation. They want that sort of benchmark as to where they're at. But I'm finding increasingly there's always something on top. So it's, can you look at board leadership? Can you look at board management relationships? Can you look at succession planning or board size? Those sorts of things, which are really very sensitive issues that have to be handled carefully.
Got it. Hence you're brought in.
Yes. The other framework which we're seeing more is because directors are elected by shareholders, we're seeing also validation of their performance and their qualifications to sit on that board and continue to contribute to the organisation in a positive way. So having a report which discloses that there has been a comprehensive program of board evaluation, a skills matrix which matches the skills of the board against the overall industry objectives, and the specialisation is another step towards satisfying shareholders and establishing the credentials of that director when they stand for re-election, or alternatively they are appointed as a nominee to a board to fulfil a particular role or purpose, that they actually have their qualifications and standing assisted by an evaluation to give them the credibility and the validation.
Got it.
And you'll see that a lot more, don't you, at AGMs when a
Very much
director
so.
is seeking re-election, and they will stand up and sometimes talk for 5 minutes about the reasons why they should be re-elected and what skills that they bring and will continue to bring to the board.
So the evaluation process assists the directors in their presentation to shareholders. We're seeing it more and more now that directors have a 5-minute window to promote themselves and their contribution to the board. So the evaluation process probably gives them the framework to say, I have been evaluated, we do make a contribution, I serve on a number of committees, I have special skills and experience, and that hopefully will contribute to them being re-elected.
Got it.
Yes.
We're going to, in the interest of time, move along and to have another poll. So you should now be able to see on your screen there is, we're just asking you, so one of the challenges that we didn't address was, the logistical challenge of managing a poll, of managing an evaluation. So if you'd just like to vote on screen, you can now see there should be a few tools to select for those who are conducting evaluations. And we'll come back to those results in a moment. In terms of the benefits that evaluations provide, I mean, you can probably talk endlessly on this one, but I'll start with you, Anne-Marie, and you can talk to the group culture piece about, the impact of evaluations.
Well, as I mentioned to you earlier, Joe, my PhD research topic was independence and conformity in boardroom decision-making. So group dynamics and culture is something very close to my heart. And, of course, there's a skill in being able to have the academic research but bring it into the boardroom from a pragmatic point of view, which hopefully I do successfully. And so when I ask or put together a questionnaire for a board, group culture is certainly a key issue, but that can be broken down into a number of different topics, and that includes board leadership, the contribution of individual directors, the relationship between board and management, the information flow that comes from management to the board, which is obviously very important too, and ultimately my job is to assess a board's ability to make decisions collectively for the good of the organisation, if you want to break it down to something quite small. So how that group operates and is very important. So while respect and being polite to each other is a civil way to conduct a meeting, that shouldn't be to the detriment of being able to have, to use governance parlance, robust discussion at the board table. Yeah,
and it's a trade-off, isn't it? You need to be able to be cohesive and be able to have those relationships and also be able to debate or challenge one another, I imagine.
Without causing offence.
Correct, yeah.
And the relationship is a very important framework to think about, because the relationship between individual directors is a very close, special relationship, because the element of trust has to be developed between the directors so they can have those robust discussions, yet still continue on when there's a group decision along the line of the decision and get on board with that and do what is best for the organisation. But also the relationship between the board and the management team, the CEO particularly, is quite critical to make sure that there's that trust and cohesiveness between the communication of the information that the board needs and the performance of the CEO and the executive team in terms of fulfilling the decisions of the board. And unless you have that connect, there can be a real disconnect if the trust is not between the board and the management team. There is a breakdown, and obviously that is where performance will fall down. So the trust element and the relationship is a very key component of the evaluation process.
Sure. Is that typically streamed via the CEO, or how does that How does
Well,
that
I
actually
mean,
work?
ultimately the chair has to manage the process. The people and the CEO obviously is assessed as a separate component of evaluations, but the CEO sits around the table effectively as one of the people contributing to the debate and providing impetus to the board discussion. So it's a process managed by the chair ideally in order to get the best outcomes. And obviously from time to time the decisions have got to be made about personnel and performance issues as well.
The other thing about group culture is that a good board will constantly be refreshing its membership in a good staged way. And so at some stage you will have a board comprised of directors who've been there for, perhaps 8 years, maybe longer, and then you've got a director who's been there for 3 or 2 or 1 year.
Sure.
So, and that's very healthy because you've got the corporate knowledge plus you've got the fresh eyes.
Yep.
But that also changes the dynamic. And every time you introduce a new director onto the board and another director steps off, the group dynamic changes.
Absolutely.
So being able to manage that is the domain of the chairman, but should never just be the domain of the chairman. It's a group role to make sure that group melds as well as possible. But that's an interesting dynamic for group culture when you have that different level of experience and time on the board.
And is that assessed in the evaluation process?
I do,
Right.
yes.
Is that fairly common?
I don't know if it's common, but I certainly do.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think the assessment can be peer-to-peer. It can be confidential. You can make comments about individual directors' perceived contribution or value in a confidential peer-to-peer assessment, which only the chair sees, or it can be an open discussion amongst the board where there's a perception that some directors are dominant,
Yep.
or passive, or earlier in their journey in terms of their contribution. But certainly, it's a good conversation to have that our directors feeling they are engaged, making good contribution to the board, and feeling they're valued. Because obviously if they're not feeling valued and engaged, their participation is in doubt, and they may not either stand or they won't continue in their journey of self-development and learning about the organisation, engaging with other directors. It's an ongoing process, and the evaluations are a nice spotlight to keep that process going forward.
In terms of, we kind of touched on that then in terms of tenure and composition of the board. So the impact of the evaluations on the composition, it looks at who has been there, what skill gaps are missing, etc. Does that actually then affect if there's a skill gap, will a board then go and source someone with that skill set? How does that translate once you've done the evaluation in terms of board composition?
Yeah, well, there's usually a committee which deals with board succession planning and organisational competency. So clearly there's re-election processes, there's nomination processes, and most constitutions allow for directors, if they aren't elected by members, who have specialist skills to be rolled in to fill a gap. So it is an ongoing dynamic as to keeping the dynamic and the skills around the table relevant to the situation and business.
I think it's also something that has to be looked at very carefully, because if you have a director who's stepping off the board and let's say they're the chairman of the audit committee, so they have very specific financial skills, and let's say this director has been on the board for 10 years or 12 years, and it's time for them to step off, then you've got to look at, taking that person off the board, what skills are you losing?
Yeah.
Do you have someone already on the board who can step into that role? And if your succession planning in the board has been good enough, that successor will have been brought in a couple of years earlier.
So you upskill an existing board member to cover the gap?
Or you've engaged a board because you need quite specific skills for the audit committee. You've already engaged someone on the board for that. Not that I'm an advocate of all directors having just that one specific skill. You need to be able to govern the whole company. But by the same token, if you have a particular industry board, let's say the mining industry, and let's say you've got a director who's stepping off who has quite specific mining experience, you might say, do we need to replace that director with the same skill set? Maybe yes, maybe no. If that director's been on the board for 10 years, how has that company and sector and industry changed over that period? And do you still need a director with identical skill set, or do you want something slightly different. So there needs to be a discussion about
But isn't
how
that
that
director
composition
then
aligns.
accountable as it changes to be across the changes in the industry and kind of up to speed? Should that not be the...
Of course, but going back to the mining example, you know, you can be a director on a mining board and be very, very successful without having been a miner.
Sure.
But you're not going to find the skills of a miner in 6 months.
Yeah.
Your skill set's going to be in some other area.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, continuous improvement and embracing change is part and parcel of being a director. We hear so much about cybersecurity, digitisation of organisations and social media. And they're topics which most directors struggle with, so we all have to get on board and embrace change and learn to bring those skills to the table, or alternatively bring in specialists from time to time when you're developing a particular piece of software or a business tool that requires those specialist skills. But it's implicit on all directors to keep on the journey of continuous improvement. So the mining engineer of 20 years ago would have very different skills to the mining engineer of today sitting on a newly listed mining company.
That's right.
Yep. I'm conscious of time and wanting to ensure we get some questions as well, so we're just going to jump to the poll results. Let me have a look. So I guess this brings us to the delivery mechanism, and one of the things that, you know, this is again one of the challenges I suspect that we touched on, but, you know, what are the common delivery mechanisms that you've come across? What works? What have you know, how do you advise people to say, well, here's a starting point?
Yeah, I guess, Anne-Marie, we all have that discussion at the beginning of the engagement. What is suitable for you? What's your appetite? And obviously it's a budget issue as well for many people, and organisational maturity, and it just depends. There's obviously off-the-shelf tools that can be used that give you an insight, but it's like most things, it has to be fit for purpose and has to be customised to suit the organisation's size and competency. So there are a number of tools that are available.
We can see, I'm just looking at the results here, and the most commonly used are paper or an online tool such as SurveyMonkey are the two, with you know, a percentage of people using external consultants, and of course there are those that aren't doing them at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. SurveyMonkey is a widely used tool, and it can be customised, but the data that's gathered has to be reviewed and tailored and analysed to produce some outcomes and some recommendations and workshop with the board. So really useful tool to gather
to do the legwork.
Do the legwork, get some confidential feedback and to get people to participate. And obviously it's flexible. People can do it anytime, anywhere in their iPads if they're travelling and they're busy. So that's a great way of collating the data, but it's only the initial phase. I don't think it will produce the outcomes that most boards would need to do an effective board analysis and board valuation.
Look, I have a very intimate relationship with my board clients. From the very beginning, I actually have a hard copy questionnaire, which I send to my clients, and that decision has actually been driven by the chairman that I work with.
Is this specific to one organisation or with multiple?
With multiple organisations. The feedback I've received is that they like the opportunity to come back and think about what I've asked and come back to write the answers rather than racing through an online tool. And my analysis from the questionnaire data is always done by me, not by a third party. And the reason for that is because I want to continue to have that intimate relationship with the data that I'm gathering prior to doing the interviews.
Sure.
And the interviews are the most critical part of the process from my perspective, because that's where the real important information will come from. The questionnaire is a way of starting that conversation.
Right.
It's a way of getting that information, such as the structure and processes of the board. Are you happy with the way the committees are working? Are the board papers turning up on time, and so on? But that doesn't really get to the nitty-gritty of the group culture and group dynamic. So
it's the conversation that goes alongside that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So my intimacy with my clients through the board process is very important to me and to them, and seems to work well, but there are definitely other delivery mechanisms, be it an online tool or, as I said before, just one piece of paper that used to be sent around the board table to tick the box.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the trust and engagement is a critical part of the process, not just the data gathering is really just the introduction, skimming the surface in order to start the conversations, the deep trust and confidentiality that we need to establish in order to get a proper outcome. That's the one-on-one interviews are critical to the process, and those candid comments that come out that allow us to provide a broad and targeted outcomes and recommendations.
But by the same token, the questionnaire does need to be tailored, and if I've been asked, for example, as I said before, to look at a more sensitive issue on top of the board performance review itself, there might be some questions that I can ask in the questionnaire that sort of opens up that discussion.
Sure.
So if I have a board that, as a result of a merger, is large and needs to be smaller, a question I might ask in the questionnaire could be, do you think that the right size for this organisation's board is 12 members, or do you think that the right number is 9 members? And the answers to that will get the directors thinking about, okay, so board succession planning is going to be part of the process. We need to start thinking about what our responses to that question will be.
Got it. So you're almost planting the seed for that to generate.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump to some questions. I'm aware we're nearly out of time, so just before we do, we'll go on. I'll just let you know. So I'll pose this to both of you. One of the questions asked is how valuable is benchmarking for board evaluations? Noting it can be difficult to establish a benchmark. For example, sector comparisons of boards are difficult to get access to, etc. And noting that evolving nature of boards means that there are different levels of maturity and adopt different governance roles.
Well, what's the criteria? I don't really see it's a benchmarking tool. I think it's very specific to each organisation in terms of their composition, the board dynamics and their circumstances. So the benchmark perhaps is that they're doing it, they're engaged, the process has started, and it's part of the overall governance framework. Is probably the first start of the benchmark, but then the deep dive and the outcomes, I think, are very organisational specific and tailored to the organisation's circumstances.
Look, I think the person who has asked that question understands the challenges of a benchmark very, very well. And I think one way around that is if you do choose to have an external board review conducted, if the person you choose has experience across a range of sectors and so on, they can at least bring that experience to bear during the board review and say, for example, I've noticed other boards in your sector employ a part-time company secretary rather than a full-time company secretary. Perhaps you should, consider that as well.
Yep.
As opposed particular data that will give you a benchmark, because all boards are different. They're constantly evolving. There's a lot of fluidity in the equation.
Got it. There's another question that's been asked, which the extension of the trust that you talk about in terms of culture is to be transparent and mature enough to have the CEO and the company secretary provide feedback on the board's performance. Are boards doing this?
Look, I think the CEO and the company secretary are an integral part of the board evaluation process because they sit around the table, they contribute to the functioning of their board, and they also contribute to the effective operation, plus they observe the behaviours and the ethics and the culture and work hand in glove, ideally with the chair. So I would suggest they're critical to the process.
Look, I agree, and particularly with the CEO who quite often will also be the managing director. So they wear two hats. They're both a member of the board and an employee of the board.
Sure.
So they have quite an interesting perspective to have. And in that, I would extend that question to say, look at the relationship between the chairman and the CEO, because that is the most critical relationship of all on the board.
Got it.
And it might extend beyond just the CEO or MD and company secretary to other key presenters to the board who contribute to the board dynamics in terms of business development, in terms of industry-specific issues. So it doesn't necessarily have to stop at the MD, CEO and the co-sec. It can include other people depending how deep the board want to go in terms of the dynamics and the accountability, and also the trust and relationship aspect of the board review. Because clearly if it can't establish that working relationship between the management team and the board and link it to be cohesive with the organisational outcomes and objectives and strategy, there's going to be a breakdown.
Look, I agree. I think the C-suites should be included if the board is happy to do that. Certainly, at least the CFO should be included in that process. Not necessarily with the questionnaire, but certainly with an interview.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to take one final question because we need to wrap up. But so there's a question that's asked: how can committee performance evaluation be useful for overall board performance evaluation?
Oh, look, I think it's a very important part of the process, because each of the committees do a lot of the work that the board doesn't have a time to do, and they can have the expertise on that committee to report back to the board. So I think it's very important that the committee's work is assessed, and that the leadership of those committees is also looked at.
Yep. And your thoughts,
Andrew?
Andrew?
Very much so. I mean, so the committee regularly does a review of its own performance in most organisations, including such fundamental things as looking at the charter, looking to see that it's really serving the purpose that it was originally designed or set up to serve, and address changes, because it may be the dynamics of change in terms of technology that it has to embrace something like social media instead of print media, which may have been part of a communications or marketing committee. It may have to embrace a wider remit. So yes, the committee's performance and their charter is a critical part of an evaluation process.
Great. Okay. Thank you both. We need to wrap up because we've gone past our timeline. There are a number of other questions that we will address post-session, and we'll be sending those out to everybody. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you both for your time and expertise.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll see you in the next session.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.